When your child is dying, you do anything that you think might change that. Things that would usually be deemed irrational, and they become perfectly rational, reasonable even. I don't know if it's because of adrenaline or desperation or what, love, but my colleagues thought I was crazy. With the temple management, the senior clerks for worship and teaching, there are expectations on me. We don't grovel, period, to anyone, let alone to Jesus of Nazareth. But these weren't normal circumstances. My child was dying. She'd barely begun to live. She's not even of age. It wasn't fair. On her or on me. And the scribes, well, they couldn't do anything. They couldn't do anything about it. What right did they have to disapprove? But Jesus of Nazareth just might be able to do something if the stories about him were true. So I tried. I wasn't the only one who sought his attention when he arrived in the city. You could not move for people in the square. His close friends hemmed him in to protect him from the crowd. He wasn't hard to identify. I was in bits. I threw myself on the floor in front of him. There was no way out for him. He would have had to have trodden on me or stepped over me to move, and even though he could have done it, I got the impression that he wouldn't do it. He agreed to come. There were so many people, everyone from the common beggar and destitute widow to the Roman centurion. It's not even that busy on market day. It's not even that busy on Passover. We were halfway to my home, and suddenly Jesus stops and turns like something had distracted him from behind. "Who touched me?" he said. It seemed a ridiculous question. Who hadn't touched him would have been a shorter list. One of his followers spoke with him, but Jesus was adamant that something unlooked for had happened in the crowd. No one knew what to make of it. Then a woman came forward, an invisible woman. She looked at the floor. She was badly dressed, in dirty clothing. Her long hair hung over her shoulders, and she stooped so low down that it almost touched the floor. My kind would have ignored her. But he didn't. He looked at her for explanation. I still don't understand what happened. Why were we wasting time here when my daughter was drawing her last breath by the second? Jesus looked at her, this woman. She was fearful and trembling, and so she should be. The crowd had stilled, and I heard her mutter something about bleeding, years of bleeding. So she was unclean as well, an unclean woman. That's why I didn't notice or even recognize her. She wasn't allowed to worship. "I touched your robe and stopped bleeding," she said to him. He told her that her faith was responsible, that she had been healed because of her own faith. I stopped dead. What had her faith got to do with anything? He was the healer. She was an unclean woman. My daughter was dying, and her faith had healed her. What were we even doing here? I was still stood there, and Abram came and beckoned me from behind. Harold was dead. "Don't bother the teacher anymore," he said. "It's too late." My heart stood still. I forgot the unclean woman. I didn't hear him approach from behind me. He spoke quietly. Do not be afraid, just believe. Like she did, that woman. Jesus went with Abraham, and I followed with the disciple group. At my door, many women were wailing. Muriel was inside, her tear-streaked face buried in her hands. I held her and sobbed. "Stop wailing," came Jesus' voice from the doorway. It was like a command that I dare not disobey. "She's only asleep," he said. The women laughed. I didn't. He walked to where she lay on her pallet bed and took her hand. "My child, get up," he said. That same authority. They didn't laugh this time. She opened her eyes and swung her legs over the side of the pallet. She opened her eyes and swung her legs over the side of the pallet. She was thin and feeble, and because she hadn't eaten in many days, and everyone stood rooted to the spot in astonished silence. Nobody knew what to do. It was me and Muriel and some of the disciples that were with him. Everyone else was still outside and hadn't seen what had happened. "She needs food," he said. He motioned to Muriel, and this seemed to knock her from her state of astonishment by the sudden need to feed Ariel. So she busied herself immediately, and he looked me straight in the face. "Do not tell anyone," he said. Perhaps it was for Ariel's protection. She was only 12, and the blind man that he'd healed had supposedly been brought up before the authorities, my authorities. What was going on here? They'd been whispering, and my colleagues had been planning to trap Jesus of Nazareth. I couldn't be party to that now. Perhaps it was for my protection. Perhaps it was for his. I thanked him. He left. The disciples followed. Muriel was helping Ariel drink between the ravenous bites of bread that she was taking. She looked at me and she grinned.